What's up, everyone? My name is Addison Her. I'm very excited to finally talk about this wonderful band, Daft Punk. Yeah. Raise your hand if you like Daft Punk. Yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, I love music. I love math. Today I'm talking about how music and math are connected and how we use that connection to build the Daft Punk experience. So some of my background, I am a creative director predominantly working in the music industry. I get to do a lot of fun stuff with stage design and lighting design. I get to work with lots of rotating, moving lights and big screens and stuff. I also make visuals for large LED walls for when artists go on tour. Everything you see here, I made in Unreal Engine. And a lot of people that do this type of work, like VJ type people, are transitioning from other software packages like C4D or whatever. They're switching into Unreal as well. Sort of the trend in the industry right now. Super nice, makes it very easy to collaborate. I'm associated with a studio called Magnopus. We are a art, technology, design studio. We touch loads of different disciplines, film, game, TV. We work a lot with Sphere. We do a lot of virtual production work. And we work a lot with Epic. I think Epic gives us arguably the coolest projects that come into our studio. We get to do a lot of very massive things with them. One of those very massive things was this Times Square show. I had the privilege of directing the visuals for 48 billboards worth of content for Ice Spice and Snoop Dogg. That was also kind of a virtual production project, actually. We used NDisplay, if any of you use NDisplay, to render all of those screens concurrently out of a single environment. Another very amazing thing we got to build with Epic that we had the privilege of working on was the Daft Punk Experience. So this was initially conceived by Alex Rigopoulos, who you might know from Guitar Hero, Rock Band. He started Harmonix. His idea was he wanted to build a monument to Daft Punk, to their music and their fashion and their visuals and these very rich worlds that they left behind. It's arguably the biggest concert that Fortnite's ever put on, at least in terms of scope, in terms of number of separate experiences inside. And also as we were building it, we had this sort of underlying motivation, which was we wanted to create musicians and visual artists in the same way that playing Harmonix games as a kid made me want to do this today. We wanted to return the favor to a new generation of kids who might be playing Fortnite, stumble upon this experience, be like, whoa, I want to be a musician one day. I want to be a visual artist one day. So the actual experience, you start out in Contact. This is an interactive music video, your Fortnite avatar flying through space. You ultimately crash land in the prologue. You put on the band's helmet, you reconnect with them in that way. Then you walk towards this large glowing pyramid. Inside the pyramid is our recreation of Alive 2007. And then from there, it's a hub world. You can choose a number of other experiences. You can go up into the studio and remix music. You can go blast robots to the beat in the arena. You can go dance with your friends to the Random Access Memories album in the disco. Or you can make a version of the Around the World music video out of Legos. So I specifically directed two of these experiences, which were Alive and Contact. They, I would say, they share in being heavy on the math and heavy on music visualization through math. So Alive was, as I'll get to, was this very beloved concert tour that happened in 2007. We did a 35-minute version of it, which is about triple the length of any other concert we had built with Epic up until that point. It's very much a tribute and a love letter to this amazing tour. And it features this transforming stage and dance floor, which I'm gonna teach you all a bit how we made today. And then Contact. Contact started out as an interactive music video, your Fortnite avatar flying through space, as I mentioned. It later became the official music video for the song and for us to do a high quality cinematic render. But yeah, so in the video, you fly through eras of Daft Punk. You're sort of going through their different albums. And in that way, it's sort of a tribute to the entire history of the band. It's like a career retrospective. I'm gonna play a short highlight reel of those two experiences now. Yeah. Thank you. All of those images are burned into my brain. I cannot tell you how many hours I spent working on that. Yeah, first I'm gonna go through Alive. So this show, famously, first happened at Coachella in 2006, actually. And it was so incredible that they took it on tour throughout 2007 throughout the world. It features these, our two robot friends, in the center of a pyramid with a suspended top. On the pyramid is an LED wall. Behind them is another LED wall with a wider pixel pitch, so there's a lot more separation between the pixels. Then surrounding them, they have this triangular lattice, and then we have traditional trussing, making a V formation with beam lights attached to them. So this tour was insane. I was not there, but apparently it was insane. I wish I was there. As this quote says, Daft Punk's Coachella set helped spark an arms race for live music technology. So when we see nowadays people like deadmau5 in his Cube, or Skrillex in his Mothership, or Anima on whatever crazy stage he's doing, or the giant, massive, crazy Tomorrowland stages that sort of unfold and stuff, many people in the industry attribute that to Alive 2007. These very architectural, highly designed, scenic stages, people weren't really doing it as much, or if they were, it wasn't on the level that Daft Punk did it. In that moment in 2007, they raised the bar for everyone. In fact, if you Google what was the most influential concert of all time, many of the answers will say Alive 2007. Another way that this concert was very influential, and one of the reasons that I love it so much, was that it was constantly revealing stuff over time. They had the restraint to sort of, at the start of the show, have almost nothing on. It started out with just beam lights, and then they turned on the back LED wall, and then they don't show you that there's an LED wall in the pyramid until like 45 minutes in during One More Time. And then also the robots had these glowing suits on them. They don't show you that, they don't turn it on until the middle of the encore, so like 5 minutes before it ends. So it's constantly building and building and building and having these unexpected twists and delights along the way, which is common in high-end stage design now, but it wasn't much of a thing before that. So right, how do we possibly do justice to this incredible show, right? I was asking myself this every night. It kept me up at night. I have never worked with an artist up until this point that was, in my brain, so prestigious that we needed to do something absolutely incredible. So there was a lot of self-imposed pressure for me and for everyone else on our team, where we were like, okay, we're not shipping anything unless it's amazing. As a result of that, constantly trying to grow, the design went through several evolutions. So first we had these sort of like shipping container arrangements. These rectangular prisms, on each one was a simulated LED wall and then a lattice. I knew I wanted to do something that could transform like the original did. So it would all kind of move around and restructure per song. But it was a little too dark. It was kind of, it felt industrial techno a bit. It wasn't really the celebratory vibe that the original Alive had. Like it would go to this very stark place, but then it would become more of a party later. So then the next iteration was, okay, let's celebrate the original. Let's make it just a party. Let's make it feel like a music festival. So we took some cues from the original album art for, this is the live album, Alive 2007, making the shape language a lot closer to the original concert, making everyone bounce around, which you do in the ultimate version that we shipped, but like you would at a real music festival, you're jumping up and down. It's supposed to feel like a party. And the stage would move a little bit, but it wasn't enough. It still didn't feel like it was good enough to ship. So then I was like, okay, what now? And then I went to the place where I always go when I need inspiration, which is a rave. In this case, it was Beyond Wonderland in Southern California, and I saw this beautiful stage called Caterpillar's Garden, which has a flower at the center and then a bunch of tapestries sort of unfolding over the audience. And I was like, okay, I could do that with the lattice in the back and then have it sort of releasing copies of itself that are flying over the heads of the audience. And I thought that might work. So then on the car ride home, I scribbled down all this crazy math like a mad scientist. And then the next day I went in Unreal and I tried to implement it. And then we ended up with the final evolution, which shipped, which is what I'm describing as a visual synthesizer. So this was a set of positional and rotational and color and pattern controls that were bound to a bunch of controls I had in Unreal and my lighting designer had access to. And then we could mix and match them to create a very, very wide latent space of potential stage transformations. And then we use this to sequence the entire show to get what I was mentioning earlier, which is that we want a constant evolution and a build-up over the course of the set list. Now I'm going to go into a bit of a deep dive of how we built that lattice. So as abstract and procedural artists, a lot of what we do is look to patterns in nature, like flowers, or in architecture, and we try to derive the math and then try to implement it in Unreal. Or we'll study math papers and try and understand just how these things could be constructed in a shader or in a Niagara system, and so on and so forth. This is what we're going to be doing today with a fairly simple example, which is the triangular lattice. People much smarter than me do crazy stuff like implementing fractals in Unreal. If you've had the Machina Infinitum plugin, it's very cool. It's the same thing. But what I hope that you walk away with is not step-by-step how to build a lattice, but rather, if I see something cool in nature that I like a jellyfish, how could I possibly go about implementing a procedural system in Unreal that simulates that? What are the steps I have to go through? So, all right, it's a bit of a puzzle. We're implementing this in Niagara. We're using a mesh renderer. Let's say that every single one of our particles is one of these tubes, so one edge of a triangle. The first thing we need to figure out is how many total particles do we need to spawn? How many edges are in this lattice? So then I would think, okay, let's research some math papers. Let's remind ourselves about triangular numbers. And we could learn that the formula for the number of elements in a triangular number with n rows, or my nth triangular number, is going to be n times n plus 1 over 2. So this is, for example, if I have a bunch of bowling pins in a triangle, first it's 1, then 3, then 6, then 10, then 15, so on and so forth. So that's going to be my formula for the number of triangles in the total lattice. But then because, remember, each particle is one edge, not a whole triangle, I multiply by 3. Then in my implementation, I'm actually copying the whole lattice several times just because I want a lot more edges to play with. I want these very large fractal arrangements of the whole shape. So then we're defining a term called instances, and then I'm going to multiply that by my number of copies. So multiply by I, and then in my case, in my final version that we shipped with, we ended up with 540 total edges. So we're here, we need to get here. Right now, they're all spawning at the exact same place in a vertical alignment. We need to set their position and their rotation so that they end up in this lattice. In order to do that, we need to solve for what type of edge I am. So am I this edge, or this edge in the triangle, as well as what row and column I belong to. But currently, all that I know about each edge that differentiates them is my incrementing Niagara ID. So this is a unique identifier that belongs to every particle. It starts at 0, then goes 1, 2, 3, all the way up until 539. So just using that value as a parameter, we need to plug that into some equations and then solve for these other values. Right, so next let's define a term called origin ID. This is just going to be the number of the triangle that I'm in order, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth. If I look at the start of each row, I can learn this fun property, which is the start of each row is given by the nth triangular number. So as I mentioned earlier, total number of elements, 0, 1, 3, 6, 10, 15. That's also going to be the value at the start of each row if I draw it out like this. I can use that information to derive the row. This math gets a little funky. It goes through a quadratic, which I will not bore you with, but that's the ending formula. Finally, I need to solve for column. So the way that we do this is I'm going to write out all of my elements in this sort of left-aligned structure here. And then I can determine that my column value is just going to be the number of hops away I am from the start of the row. So if I have an origin ID of 5 in the middle there, my start of the row is going to be 3. I'm 2 hops away. That's my column value. Then I'm going to do a little bit of transformation to those coordinates so that previously I'm at a left aligned. I'm going to spread them out and then offset them so that I end up with this center symmetrical triangular structure. So I'm here now. I need to get here. So I'm pretty close. I still have 3 copies of every single particle all aligned in the same place, and my scale's a little off. The triangle right now is kind of too short. So let's do those final steps. Right now, I'm spawning my particles at the exact values of my row and column that I just derived. So I'm going 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, so on and so forth. That's close, as I said. It's not quite right, though, because if we look at a diagram of a triangular lattice, we can see that it's made of 30, 60, 90s. So for every x that I go over, I'm actually going down x root 3. That's just the edge lengths of a 30, 60, 90. So the vertical edge is going to be a little taller. That means currently my triangle is too short. I need to scale the whole thing vertically by a factor of root 3. And then this final step, I have all my particles currently vertically aligned. They're overlapping. I just need to get them to unfold and become the triangle. So I'm going to take the modulo of my ID by 3. If I get 0, then I know I'm this edge, and I'm going to rotate by 30 degrees this way. If I get 1, I know I'm this edge. I'll rotate by negative 30 degrees. If I get 2, I'll rotate by 90 degrees. Then I just need to calculate these offsets. So right now they're all at the red dot. They need to go to their pink dots. That's just some more 30, 60, 90 math. Calculate those offsets, rotate them, then we're done. Cool. So I've successfully derived all the math that I need. I did this on paper first, but now I need to implement it in Unreal. I will not bore you with that whole process, but instead I will leave you with some advice, which is probably for procedural art, very math-heavy art like this, I would suggest against using nodes. You will end up with spaghetti. Even if you clean up your spaghetti, it will just be very difficult for anyone coming after you to read math. It's not intuitive to read like very deep math that way. Instead, what I would suggest is using HLSL. So you can create these custom HLSL blocks in shaders, in your material graph, or in Niagara Scratchpad. They're pretty simple to set up. You have all of your inputs on one side, all of your outputs on another side, and then you're just going to transform your ins into your outs using the code in the middle. You can comment everything as you normally would, and then anyone coming after you can read it. Yeah, if you don't know HLSL, I would suggest learning it, or at least this version of it. Unreal makes it pretty easy. It kind of strips out all the difficult parts, and then you're essentially just writing kind of plain text into the editor. Right, so we have just successfully made this whole shape procedurally in Niagara. Why did I do that instead of just modeling it in Blender, right? It would have taken like 5 minutes to create this shape. The reason is I want every edge to know intuitively a bunch of information about itself. I wanted to understand what row it belongs to, what column, what its edge type is, what its origin ID is. And then I can use all of that information that's stored in the particle to then unfold the shape as I was showing before and sort of break apart this whole lattice structure. So yeah, in Niagara, I'm going to go into my particle. I'm going to add a bunch of variables for each piece of metadata. Then it'll be stored per particle, and then I can access that later when I want to do my transformation math. So here are a set of the isolated transformations that I'm applying to the lattice, and these all combined together make those sorts of fractal arrangements that I was showing earlier. So I can offset my position just based on what copy of the triangle I am, and I can get this slinky effect, or I can rotate them, or I can split up the rows like this, or I can split apart the edges, and so on and so forth. I also had several controls for the actual patterns on the lattice, so like which edges are lighting up at what times, as well as patterns for the beam lights that were attached to each lattice. Finally then, I've implemented everything in Niagara at this point. Now I'm going to go and do a little bit of blueprint work just to make this easier for anyone who's coming after me to sequence the whole show. So I'm going to expose all of those parameters into a Niagara parameter collection. I will wire those into a blueprint, separate up all of my components and label them so it's neat and organized, and then expose those variables to sequencer so that everything's sort of diffused. All of that math is diffused into a set of very legible controls that me and the other lighting designer can go, and we can just key the entire show that way. It's pretty quick. Finally, okay, moving out of implementation into theory a little bit. Here's where we would take a step back and think about what we normally do as lighting designers in the real world, and then apply them in-game. So if I'm running lights for a real concert, I want to make people cry at the right time. I want to make people jump at the right time or dance at the right time, feel joy, hug their friends, whatever. I'm listening to what the music is telling me, what the artist wants their music to say, and I'm attempting to translate that into the visuals of the show. So we do the same thing here in game, right? We're understanding the entire arc that the show takes, and we try to tell a story over those several songs. We want to highlight the song structure, so like when the drop comes, you release everything, then you pull back between the drops. Tension and release, of course, this is huge in any art form. And then one that I'll call out is embracing minimalism. So one pet peeve of mine in lighting design is when someone spends a ton of money on having a bunch of cool lights and lasers, and then they turn on everything at once for the whole concert. And it's just visual overload of your lasers are crisscrossing with your beams. There's no focal point, there's no real composition. So in general, what I've found, at least at the risk of sounding pretentious, like more high-end stage design, is people tend to do like all of the beam lights or just a single laser cutting down the middle of the audience. That tends to be more effective. It tends to elicit more emotion from people. In general, it's just a better way of creating a moment. Cool, so then touching on game design for a minute. At the center of the stage, we had this notion of an evolving dance floor. So the same way that we wanted the alive show and its lights to constantly be evolving and transforming over time, we wanted the gameplay to evolve and transform as well. Constantly trying to surprise and delight people with new mechanics. So my studio and I have built several concerts for Fortnite at this point in collaboration with Epic. And after all of them, we always go on social media and sort of read every comment that we can find, and we try to make an understanding of what people liked or didn't like about the show. And if I were to boil that all down into one sentiment, it's that people tend to fall into one of two camps. They either are leaning back, they love spectacle, they love your Travis Scott's like massive in BR stomping around, loads of visual effects firing off in the background. And then there's another camp of players who want to lean in. Their hands are on a controller, they want to still feel like they're playing a game, they want to feel engaged. So we, as designers, try to engage both of those camps of players simultaneously. And what that philosophy meant in Daft Punk and Alive was this pit at the center, or the sea of simulation, if you're into Tron. This was a set of pixels that could constantly transform and reconfigure themselves to enable new mechanics. So maybe in one song, I'm bouncing to the beat, then I'm running around in a fluid sim, then I'm grinding in circles for around the world, then I'm flying at the end, and so on and so forth. So, as I said, we're always trying to surprise and delight players with new mechanics. If I want to lean back, I can jump out of the pit and go hang out on the sides. If I want to lean in, I can literally dive into the sea of simulation and then play with whatever mechanics happening at the same time. This design philosophy is somewhat pulled from Nintendo. There's some really great talks where they're like, difficulty levels for Nintendo are not you're picking easy or medium. You're instead, as a player, at any moment, you can hop between difficulty levels. So same thing here, it's fully choice driven. At any time you can dive into or out of the pit. Okay, cool, that was Alive. Now moving on to Contact. Yeah, so Contact. This was the last song on the last album that Daft Punk ever released. It means a lot to a lot of people. It meant a lot to me. So again, it was really the question of like, how do we possibly do justice to this incredible piece of music? And the way that it was initially structured was, okay, we're journeying through eras of Daft Punk's history. We're going album by album. So we start out floating in space. Here we're referencing Discovery and Interstellar 4.5. Then Stella pulls us in through her portal and she takes us into this space station made out of synth gear and cables and musical instruments. That's referencing Random Access Memories, which was an album very much about the physicality of making music and making music with your friends. Then the synth cables sort of click together over time and launch us faster and faster and faster to warp speed. Here we're going through a lot of visuals associated with alive. Finally, towards the end, everything sort of rips apart. We're just falling through raw data, essentially. This is a wink at Tron, and also kind of a reference to Rez, if you've played that game. And then finally, ultimately, we land on the planet from Electroma and from their epilogue, their breakup video. So that was the structural layer on top. Underneath that, we also had a bit of a narrative layer that we were trying to imbue this thing with, which is essentially the idea that everything in the universe, down to its finest atoms, is made out of music. So we're trying to show that, the fabric of space-time is getting ripped apart into waveforms. Those waveforms spiral into DNA. Later on, as we're falling through the data is in the form of mechanical sheet music notation. So this, it was made by a lot of musicians. We wanted to imbue this whole thing with our love for music and a very musical soul. So now a deep dive in contact. I'm not going to go through one thing like I did for Alive. Instead, I'll do sort of rapid fire through several different effects. So the first thing we did was board the entire thing and make a color script. The reason I'm showing this, because you might be like, oh, this is standard on every production, is as a procedural and abstract artist in the past, I tended to make the mistake of thinking like, oh, I'll just make a math system and then I'll just let the numbers kind of resolve into something cool and then I'll ship that. But on a very large production like this, we needed to make sure that everyone was on board. We all knew exactly what we were making. We had boards, color script, key art, concept art, etc. Just made everything a whole lot smoother. Then we applied a departmental sequencer setup. This is something I enforce on all of my projects. I think I first learned it from Megan Stifter at Epic. But we have blocks for every song in our parent sequence, or in this case, every scene in Contact. If I dive into one of those blocks, then I have departmental tracks. So I have one for visual effects, one for interactivity, for game design, animation, environment, lighting, so on and so forth. So in a Perforce workflow where people are checking out individual assets, once again, this just makes it a lot smoother for large teams to work without stepping on each other. Then, as I said, gonna go rapid fire through some effects. This is at the end of the musical deconstruction scene. So I've accelerated essentially to Mach speed. I'm coming up upon these two walls of the words from Technologic. And as I get closer, they are extruding the shapes of the Daft Punk helmets from them. So in order to achieve this, the first thing we did was listen to Technologic, look at the lyrics, and write down every possible word that the baby says. Fun fact, this font is just Arial. That's the font from the original video. He says exactly 64 words because music is math, and it's 16 measures with 4 beats per measure, 1 word per beat, which makes a nice symmetrical sprite sheet. It's a perfect square, power of 2. It's gonna MIP really well when I get to optimizing later. Then, based on my particle index, I'm just gonna UV into a random place on that sprite sheet. Then we took the helmet models into Houdini and we baked them into one map on the red channel for displacement, and then another map on the green channel for my base color. As my avatar gets closer to the origin point of these two walls, I am just increasing the amplitude of displacement. This has the effect of the helmets pushing out. And then finally, when I want the helmets to turn on at the right time, I'm just gonna look wherever my base color is dark, and then I'm gonna use that to make that specific area emissive on the moment of the drop. That brings us into this next scene, which is waves of data. This is sort of the Tron wink or the Rez homage. There's an effect at the end called time sculptures, which is a term that I just made up. Maybe you can come up with something better. But it was essentially a method that we derived of taking a bit of 2D content and then turning it into like this 3D zoetrope effect. So this running robot here, this is from Daft Punk's Infinity Repeating video. So what we did was, again, we went in Houdini. We essentially made a full sprite sheet of the animation. Then we masked out anywhere where it was dark. And then we spawned geometry in the areas where it was bright and then baked the base color into that. Then we take those models back into Unreal, and we just sort of shine a light back and forth down it. This has the effect of illuminating each layer in sequence, but down the depth axis, and then you get this really trippy zoetrope effect. Now for my favorite scene, which internally was called oscilloscope. So the oscilloscope was based on my most favorite math concept, which is a Lissajous curve. So if you're not familiar, a Lissajous is what you get when you plot several sine waves against each other in each dimension. So on a two-dimensional Lissajous, which is what these figures are showing, I have one sine wave oscillating on the x-axis, another sine wave oscillating on the y-axis, and when I plot their amplitudes relative to each other, I get all these beautiful curves, right? On the left is going to be my frequencies of each sine wave relative to each other, one for the x dimension, one for the y, and then I can also apply a phase or an offset between my two waves. Those different parameters give me loads of different beautiful permutations of curves. So yeah, once again, we implemented this effect in Unreal in Niagara. On the top right, you can see very tiny dots representing where each particle thinks it is, and then we used a ribbon renderer just to connect all those dots. The important thing to call out here is that with ribbon renderers, it's going to connect between every Niagara ID in order. It'll go from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have to make sure that, similar to how we did the lattice, we're using our Niagara ID to get all of those particles onto these curves in order. So then the math here, this is a parametric equation. You might be used to seeing like y is a function of x, like y equals x squared. In a lot of shader art and procedural art, and just if you're writing in Unreal, we tend to use parametrics. So we have all of our dimensions x, y, and z expressed as a function of t. In this case, t you can think of as our Niagara ID multiplied by a step size. So if I shrink that step size, I have way more detail in my curve. I'm going 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I have a very broad step size, I want to optimize my effect later. I'm going 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And as I increase that value, I'm stepping through the curve. Then at our actual math, this is what I was just mentioning. We have a sine wave on x. We have a sine wave on y. They each have unique frequencies associated with them. And then I'm also applying a phase offset to one dimension. Finally, for z, z in this case I'm using as depth. Here I'm essentially just, as I'm drawing out this curve, I'm also walking forward in space. I'm just increasing my z value as I'm drawing out the curve. And this was great for contact because you're constantly hurtling forward. We wanted the effect to be visible out in the distance, but also be parallaxing out towards me. So that's why we did that variation of the math. Okay, the reason why I love Lissajous so much is because they can encode music. So if I'm on a piano, I'm going to play a major triad, which is like your classic C, E, G chord. It's going to be very bright and cheery. Each one of those notes has a root frequency associated with it that I can plot as a Lissajous. So I have C here oscillating, I have E up, and then I have G going into the depth. If I plot all of those amplitudes, I get this very beautiful 3D Lissajous curve. Alternatively, if I play like something a little more chaotic, like a diminished seventh, something kind of angry and Beethoven-y, then I'm gonna get chaos. I'm gonna get dots everywhere, like that one. This is very cool because we are literally visualizing music with the math, right? That's why I love them so much. So what we did in Contact was we printed out the sheet music, we transcribed the chord progression for this moment of the song, and then we figured out what notes corresponded to what frequencies, and then we literally encoded it into the visuals that you see. So as you're flying through space, you're literally seeing the music in front of you, which I don't think anyone noticed, but it was just our way of, again, imbuing the whole thing with this musical soul, this love for music and math. So then finally, that brings us to our DNA scene. This is the last one that I'll talk about. What I want to highlight here is this transition. So this is right after the scene I was just talking about, the oscilloscope. The different waveforms sort of fold and become this perfect spiraling double helix representing the DNA structure. The reason that this transition is so smooth and works so well is because the math is exactly the same. DNA, as it turns out, can also be modeled as a Lissajous curve. The reason that is because if we think about DNA, it's a double helix, right? If I take one of those spirals, I'm essentially just drawing a circle and then walking forward in space as I'm doing it, right? So if we go back to our Lissajous diagram, a circle is a Lissajous with two sine waves, both oscillating with frequencies of 1 and then an offset of pi/2. So then it ends up actually being the same math. I'm just interpolating my parameters. So then we plug that in here. We get sine of t plus pi/2, and then I just walk forward as I'm doing it. And that's how that transition ended up being so smooth. When we learned about this, this was incredibly fascinating to me. So then I started looking into what else can be modeled as Lissajous, and turns out biologists use it all the time. It's in our metabolic processes, how we breathe, how our heart rate works. It's on how neurons fire and talk to each other. It's also in how DNA folds up in the body in knots. And I don't know, it's very fascinating. All of it sort of affirms my belief that music is math, the universe is made of math, so therefore the universe is made of music. Thank you.